like you to say your name and spell it and your current position.
My name is Ken Hechler, Hechler, and I am Secretary of State, have been Secretary of State since 1985.
Can we continue, Pete?
Yep.
Okay. What I'd like to do is go back to the 60s, the latter part of the 60s in particular, and talk about some of the things that happened at that period of time and what you were doing and how you got involved. So if we look at 1967, 68, 69, can you tell us where you were, what you were doing, what your position was? And
I was serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing the 4th Congressional District, which contained at that time more coal miners than any other congressional district in the United States.
And at that period of time, you became involved with the Black Lung movement, even before it was formalized. Can you talk about how you got drawn into that?
I was very shocked by the coal mine disaster which occurred in Consolidation Coal Company No. 9 mine at Farmington, West Virginia, a disaster which caused the deaths of 78 coal miners on the 22nd of November, 1968. And the widows of the miners who were killed asked me to meet with them. I thought the meeting was going to be for the purpose of consoling them for the loss of their husbands, but they asked me whether I shouldn't be, can't you do something, they said, to try to make sure that we can protect not only the safety of miners, but also to protect them against this terrible disease called pneumoconiosis, or black lung. And from that point on, I became very actively involved in trying to help stimulate both the state legislature and the Congress of the United States to pass legislation which would put a ceiling on the amount of coal dust allowed in the mines, as well as compensating miners for black lung disease, which seemed to be an almost inevitable accompaniment of working in the mines.
One of the things that led up to the legislation finally being passed in West Virginia was the Wildcat Strike that swept through the mines across, starting in the southern part of the state and then moving all over. What was your reaction to that strike? And
I think that the determination of coal miners to give up their wages and to go on a wildcat strike, which eventually affected 100% of the some 40,000 coal miners throughout the state of West Virginia, indicated that there must be something done, and I think everyone realized, including myself, that this was going to be the determining factor that would force the state legislature to act, and later also to force the Congress to act, because they recognized, as all of us did who were in Congress and also the state legislators, that if the coal miners gave up their wages and in defiance of the leadership of the United Mine Workers Union, or this was a serious issue that could only be confronted directly by legislation.
I read somewhere that you were termed, or you termed yourself the original Fink of the mine workers, because you suggested that the union, particularly headquarters union, wasn't doing enough. Did you come to head with the mine workers leadership at that time?
Yes, because it became obvious to me that the leadership headed by Tony Boyle, who was the then president of the United Mine Workers of America, were simply not doing enough in terms of pushing for legislation. As a matter of fact, the United Mine Workers called me, their people called me on the phone and said, why don't you just introduce two different bills, one on health, and one on safety. And then we'll just forget about the health bill and just say we've introduced it and concentrate on the safety bill, because they said the Farmington disaster had nothing to do with black lung, ignoring the fact that, of course, coal dust in the mines, when it is ignited, causes the kinds of explosions that occurred at Farmington. But it became obvious to me, and I told the leadership of the United Mine Workers that now was the time, in 1968 and 69, because of the fact that national attention had been focused on the problems of coal miners, now was the time to move aggressively in one bill that would cover not only safety measures to protect the safety of miners, but also to move aggressively to put a ceiling on the amount of coal dust in the mines, and also to compensate miners for black lung. And they argued very strenuously with me against. They say, you're going to lose the whole bill if you do that. And I said, no, you're wrong. We're going to win the whole bill. And we did.
There were a lot of interesting characters, including yourself, during this period of time, traveling throughout West Virginia, in particular, Buff, Rasmussen, and Wells. Can you talk about your experience with them and any little stories that you might have about doing things with them, your relationship with them?
Actually, I didn't really join the agitators for black lung reform until after the Farmington disaster. Prior to November 20, 1968, Don Rasmussen and Hoy Wells and Dr. I.E. Buff, accompanied by a number of the coal miners, had been holding a series of meetings, perhaps not as well attended, but they had already started talking about the necessity for protecting miners against this crippling disease. And Dr. Rasmussen himself, of course, had had many years of experience examining coal miners in his own clinic, and Dr. Buff, a heart specialist, was very upset with the fact that he had to sign death certificates where people alleged, the coal companies alleged that particular miners had died of heart disease, when he realized that it simply was a case of the burden of on the lungs causing damage to the heart and thereby resulting in heart disease. And Dr. Buff, a cardiologist, teamed up with Dr. Wells, who was a pathologist, and having done a lot of autopsies, he could also see the reasons for this. But these three men, accompanied by a number of coal miners as well as Vista workers, headed by Craig Robinson particularly, who helped organize some of these meetings. And the meetings started getting bigger after I joined them, not because of my joining them, but rather because of the fact that the focus and the anger of the miners as a result of inaction by their union, and the constant stress by the coal operators that black lung is good for you, it probably prevents pneumonia, and the medical doctors hired by the coal companies kept emphasizing that this was not a crippling disease. So this angered the miners and caused us to start having a number of increasingly well-attended, better attended rallies throughout the state. And in January and February, particularly in 1969, we had two very large rallies at the Civic Center and at the Municipal Auditorium that drew thousands and thousands of miners and widows throughout the state. But I think the real spark plug of all of this was Don Rasmussen, because he had the experience of having examined the miners at his pulmonary clinic, and he was able to provide the kind of sensible medical technology through his own experience, and Dr. Buff was, I guess you could call him a little bit more demagogic in the manner in which the emotional manner in which yet he did stir up the crowds, and that was one of the chief virtues of Dr. Buff. And Dr. Wells had the ability to demonstrate with pieces of coal miners' lungs that had died to show how the coal dust could affect those and crumble them up in his fingers.
So particularly Dr. Buff he was an extremely colorful person from what I read. But remember I told you I have the picture of you with the bologna. Can you talk about some of the times when you used that as a prop? And could you somehow mention it another way?
Well, I recall I'd been invited to one of the big rallies, perhaps the biggest of all, over at the Civic Center. I think there were about 6,000 to 8,000 miners that crowded into the Civic Center. I think this was on a Sunday, and not many stores were open on a Sunday, but I happened to be driving along, and I saw this delicatessen that was open, and I saw in the window this tremendous slab of bologna that was about 15 to 18 inches long and very, very thick, hanging in the window. And I stopped my Jeep and I went in and said, "How much is that bologna?" And so I put down the money. I put the bologna in a paper bag because I didn't want anybody to see it when I got over to the Civic Center. And then when I got up to speak before the miners, I said, first of all, I said, the West Virginia Medical Association has a special message for you. I held up a big placard that said, "Black lung is good for you," which of course is exactly what they've been saying. Then I said, the United Mine Workers has also said that they're on your side. And here's my answer to that. I took this slab of bologna up and held it before the crowd. And of course, this stirred up tremendous enthusiasm and laughter on the part of the crowd. But you see, the combination of Dr. Buff's oratory, and the down-to-earth statistical evidence presented by Dr. Rasmussen really made sure that this movement would succeed.
Did you attend any other demonstrations where miners would basically give testimony about what had happened to them?
All over the coal fields after the Farmington disaster, we organized rallies at Matewan, at Vivian in McDowell County, Matewan in Mingo County, Clifftop in Fayette County. In fact, throughout the coal fields, we had a whole series of rallies. Craig Robinson was very helpful as a VISTA worker in helping to organize some of those rallies. And we began to get the feeling that the overwhelming majority of coal miners throughout the Appalachian area were supporting our efforts, despite the fact that the union was a little bit disturbed at the fact that these miners were not following their orders. And they tried to stop the Wildcat Strike, which of course they couldn't. And eventually, the coal companies had to fold because they couldn't afford to have all their miners out on strike. And this was a movement, a real grassroots movement that enlisted not only the miners themselves, but the news media covered it very thoroughly. I think I must say that the Kentucky newspapers covered it a little better than the West Virginia newspapers, particularly the Louisville Courier-Journal, which had an outstanding reporter named Ward Sinclair, And the New York Times sent down a reporter named Ben Franklin, who did some beautiful, insightful stories on this movement, which served to alert the Congress as to the need for action.
You mean the federal?
Yes.
So that we move from what happened in West Virginia in terms of the legislation regarding compensation to that same year,
Yes,
federal act.
the West Virginia legislature was in session until March, and they passed a fairly good compensation bill, which for the first time made black lung pneumoconiosis compensable under the workers' compensation laws. Theretofore, it had not been. And after March, where the focus moved very quickly to the Congress of the United States, at which time Dr. Rasmussen made frequent trips, as did Dr. Buff and Dr. Wells, up to Washington, D.C. to testify, both before House and Senate committees. And we arranged to bring a number of coal miners to Washington to personally demonstrate some of the bad effects of coal dust on the manner in which they could breathe. I would bring in specialists from Bethesda, from the health center there, National Institute of Health, in order to make sure that as the miners hopped up and down on one foot and they took their pulse before and after, the legislators could see the results of their inability to breathe, but we always had doctors there to make sure that they didn't have a heart attack. But I think the willingness of the three doctors who organized a group called Physicians for Coal Mine Health and Safety. It was supposed to be a large organization, but it really turned out to be primarily those three doctors. But their willingness to drop everything and come up and testify before Congress was very influential. And the interest of television, radio, and all the newsprint media served to educate the members of Congress throughout the nation, even in those areas that didn't have coal mining. And I think that the combination of all these things served to make sure that the members of Congress really understood the problem. Very influential also were the widows of Farmington, who made a number of trips at my expense to come up to Washington and there are very few members of the President's cabinet or United States senators or congressmen that could refuse a request from a widow of Farmington to have an audience and explain exactly what the problems were and how necessary it was to pass the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act. And then along about May the 30th in 1969, Jock Yablonsky decided that he would announce his entrance into the race for the presidency of the United Mine Workers against Tony Boyle. And Jock Yablonsky was a very valuable ally in bringing focus on the fact that Tony Boyle and the then leadership of the United Mine Workers had turned their backs on black lung reform. And the competition of Yablonsky bringing this forcibly to the attention of the nation, I think served to make the prospects for passage of that legislation in 1969 even more favorable.
Seems like President Nixon, at that time, President Nixon wanted that proposed legislation to just go away.
President Nixon sent up a bill to the Congress that called for a level of 4.5 milligrams per cubic meter of coal dust in the mines. My bill called for 3.0 rather than 4.5. And As a result of that, one of the employees of the Bureau of Mines and Department of the Interior, named Dave Finnegan, who had helped us draft this bill and who had also helped some of the senators with a lower level, was fired because of that. I hired Dave Finnegan and got a lot of help from him, but the president himself was very, very negative on supporting any bill that would really provide meaningful relief in terms of the amount of coal dust allowed in the mines. And this feeling on the part of the president was shared by the leadership of the Republican Party in Congress. President Ford, who was then Jerry Ford, the Republican leader in the House, when the bill came up before the House, introduced what's called a recommittal motion, which is a motion to kill the black lung provisions of the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act. Fortunately, we were able to beat that back, and for a long, long time, it was rumored that President Nixon would actually veto the bill itself because of the fact that it contained protection against black lung. And it was at this point that the widows of Farmington again made a visit to Washington over the period between Christmas and New Year. And it was at this point that we circulated the rumor that there would be a nationwide cold strike if President Nixon vetoed the bill. And we got that message through in such a way that he reluctantly signed the bill and then issued a very strong negative criticism of the black lung provisions. But the combination of the expertise of people like Dave Finnegan, former employee of the Department of Interior's Bureau of Mines, the determination of the West Virginia coal miners, the doctors who provided the necessary physical evidence, and the attention of the news media also, all these things combined to provide a really strong and effective coal mine health and safety bill, which was finally signed in the closing months of 1969. Every coal mine safety bill prior to that had started out being a fairly strong bill when it was introduced, and then gradually weakened by the pressure of the coal industry lobbyists. And the 1969 bill began to get stronger and stronger because of the combination of forces that were supporting it among the coal miners, the widows, the doctors, and the attention that the nation received from the news media. And as it began to get stronger and stronger and stronger, I think finally the coal operators said, we better just shut up now and let it pass, or else it'll get even stronger. But it's an interesting contrast between what happened in 1969 and what happened in prior years. And I certainly have to give a tremendous lot of credit to the doctors who started this whole proceeding.
Where are we now? What would you, certainly the compensation has changed in terms of presumption, and it seems like fewer miners are getting compensated.
Well, not only that, but of course the safety features of the bill have dramatically decreased the number of deaths and injuries in the mines. There has since 1968 not been a multiple disaster like we had at Farmington, with the exception of one explosion that happened over in Hyden, Kentucky, that killed over 30 miners, but that was only during the period when the Nixon administration was not enforcing the law as well. But today, I think one of the problems that we've had today is certainly the bureaucratic failure to carry out the intent of the law in compensating the miners, because the law itself was weakened on several occasions during the Reagan administration, making it far more difficult in terms of setting up a bureaucracy that would refuse and decline compensation to some miners. We've also had some problems with the fact that the coal companies themselves have tampered with the tests of the amount of coal dust per cubic meter in the mines. And fortunately, we now have J. Davitt McAteer, who is the administrator and assistant secretary of labor, who has been able to crack down on some of the fraud in reporting the amount of coal dust. It's interesting that my bill in 1969 transferred authority from the Bureau of Mines to the Department of Labor, and members of the committees that were considering my bill argued strenuously against that. They said it ought to stay in the Bureau of Mines. I said, well, the Bureau of Mines is primarily a production-oriented agency. We ought to have an employee-oriented agency administering this law. They overruled my objections, but 3 or 4 years after I left Congress, they took some of my arguments in order to make that transfer where it is now under the Department of Labor, and I think administered far more effectively by supporters of health and safety like Davitt McAteer.
Okay, stop tape.
Yeah,
He said this
I
company,
think that
okay.
well,
So
Oh,
we're,
oh,
we're
wait.
looking at the union. I mean, why? You know, Lynn and I were talking about this. I'm a strong unionist from way back, but they were supposed to be there for their members. And why were they having so much difficulty supporting the proposed legislation in West Virginia? And
well, I think that I began to criticize the United Mine Workers early on because of their lack of aggressive support of real meaningful health legislation. And I began very disturbed by the fact that those rebels in the coal fields that were demanding action were not getting sympathetic support. And I think when I began to criticize the United Mine Workers, why they overreacted against me personally for some reason, and they resented the fact that they hadn't come up with this idea first. And I think that psychologically that was one of the reasons that they were initially opposed, but perhaps even more fundamental to that, I think that Tony Boyle himself over the years had gotten to be a little bit too cozy with the coal operators themselves. And the outrageous thing which he said up at Farmington, that the Consolidation Coal Company has always been a good company and they have a good safety record, and the contrast between John L. Lewis, who emerged from the mines with a blackened face and Shakespearean rhetoric, denounced those who were guilty of industrial murder. You had Boyle coming up in a long black limousine with a rose in his buttonhole, and he almost felt as though he would take the silk handkerchief out of his pocket to brush away any flick of dust that may have appeared. And the contrast between Boyle and Lewis was something that so infuriated the miners as to cause them to be much more aggressive. But I find it very difficult to explain away or to really understand why Boyle, instead of denouncing me as a fink, why he didn't just recognize that the course of action he should have taken was to support efforts for improving the health and safety of those people he was supposed to represent. And then, of course, when Jock Yablonsky came out the campaign against Boyle. In some instances, this caused Boyle to try to have a hurry up, catch up on some of his policies, and nevertheless, he was never able to convince everybody, and that he really was serious about supporting those that he should have been supporting all along. It's a very, very difficult chapter in history, in labor history, to understand why the head of a union violated his obligations to his men who were working underground. It's hard for me to understand, and of course, the hardest thing of all to understand is why he so resented the candidacy of Jablonski that he would organize the goons that murdered him and murdered Jablonski's wife and daughter. But I am so convinced that this movement would not have succeeded had not a person like Dr. Rasmussen spent all of his time and effort in terms of providing the necessary medical underpinning for the entire movement, and to recognize also that those who advocated that X-rays were the only way that you could really determine pneumoconiosis. And Dr. Rasmussen was extremely effective in pointing out that as a result of his examination of thousands of miners, that many disabilities occurred in simple pneumoconiosis, where the dust in the lungs could not be clearly identified by X-ray. The X-ray could only pick up when lumps of coal dust coalesced in the lungs. And Dr. Rasmussen, by introducing the revolutionary blood gas tests through the use of treadmill and the testing through how well the blood was being oxygenated, these things, I think, were extremely helpful in changing the law and improving the law, because the first law that we passed put perhaps too much emphasis on X-ray, and by 1973, when Dr. Rasmussen was able to come up and convince the Congress that we had to alter the law to allow the blood gas test and other things besides the X-ray, and to introduce the very important feature of presumption that if a disability occurred and the miner had difficulty in breathing and was disabled because of that, that it was caused, presumably, that's what I mean by presumption that that disability was caused by working in the mines and breathing coal dust. That was his great contribution, I think, toward improving the law in 1973, which later on, of course, we had some backsliding later on under the Reagan administration, when they decided that this program was a little bit too expensive, and they made the hoops through which miners had to run and the hurdles they had to go over before they could get compensation much higher and more difficult.
To move a little more into the future again, or in the present, when we saw Dr. Rasmussen, now it's about a month and a half ago, he said that he now has 12 cases of complicated co-workers pneumoconiosis. And he had 2 guys in there in the clinic who had pretty significant silicosis cases, young men. We're supposed to have gotten rid of these problems, right? They're totally preventable. What's happened?
Yeah, what has happened essentially is I think it was about 1985 that the law was changed under the Reagan administration, and I think that as a result of that change, by introducing the necessity for a whole series of reviews of the initial diagnosis, that it has become far more difficult for approvals. Approval rate is way down. And when I was in Congress, we used to get about I think 75 or 80% of the applications approved. Now it's down in the single-digit figures, close to 10%. And this is as a result of these new bureaucratic regulations that have been put in, which is very unfortunate, because we were hoping at the time the law was first passed that eventually we would get, by reducing the amount of coal dust in the mines, eventually we would get rid of black lung entirely. That proved to be a pipe dream, because even though we were able to reduce the number of cases, there's still now, because of the bureaucratic regulations that have been introduced, there's still miners with complicated pneumoconiosis that really ought to be declared disabled and receive the necessary compensation under the current law.
You mentioned earlier some of the things that might have kept the mines from becoming as healthy as they could possibly be. Can you think of any others? I think you had mentioned that one of the things was the dust fraud, the sampling fraud, but anything else you can think of? Because these diseases are preventable. We know that, silicosis and black lung, certainly. We have different controls and so on that should be able to take care of that.
Well, first of all, there's always tremendous resistance on the part of those that operate the coal mines themselves on economic terms. When we first brought up the health and safety law in 1969, I received many letters and many phone calls and many visits from coal operators saying, competitively, you're going to drive us out of business because we can't afford to put these improvements into effect. And of course, in order to reduce the amount of coal dust in the mines, you can do this by several ways. You can rock dust the mines. In addition to that, you can change the angle of the drill that drills into the face of the mine, and you can accompany the drill with sprays of water and other liquids that would keep down the amount of coal dust. All these things slow down production, and naturally every coal operator is interested in higher production, and the technology in the mines has reduced the number of miners, which have saved a lot of money and have produced much more tonnage of coal per coal miner. And this means greater profits. And in a profit and loss business, of course, the coal operators are interested in what produces greater profit. Therefore, this is the incentive to create the kind of fraud which has the bad sampling, fraudulent sampling of coal dust, as well as trying to avoid those things which produce less coal dust in the mines. And as a result of all this, why we haven't completely cured the problem, because we have this built-in resistance from those that are inspired by the profit motive.
Anything else you'd like to say about the movement, about where we've been, where we're going?
I'm sure I'll think of a lot of other things after you leave, but both health and safety. I first ran into J. Davitt McIntyre when he was a law student at West Virginia University back in 1968. And even then, he was one of the early crusaders to join us in our efforts to try to pass the legislation. And he early on joined with Ralph Nader as one of Nader's raiders in that area. And it's one of the very, very fortunate things for coal miners that he was appointed by President Clinton to be the Assistant Secretary of Labor in charge of the Mine Safety and Health Administration. David McAteer comes from the Fairmont area. He now lives over in Shepherdstown, where he can go easily to his job. But the results have been very dramatic in terms of his leadership to try to ensure that that the searchlight is shined on any fraudulent sampling by the coal operators who are obligated to sample the coal dust. And he has actually moved to take over some of that sampling rather than giving it into the hands of the coal operators. But the most dramatic thing is the reduction in the number of fatalities that have occurred, and the fact that we no longer have the kind of multiple disasters such as Farmington, which occurred in 1968. And that's to David McAteer's credit, to his leadership on behalf of protecting the health and safety of coal miners everywhere.
When you were talking about David being one of Nader's raiders, it reminded me that Nader had an influence on the West Virginia struggle, even though he never really came here, right? Can you talk about his involvement?
One of the rallies that we had at the Civic Center was preceded by a meeting that I had with Ralph Nader at his invitation, and he asked me if I would read a letter from him to the miners, even though he did not want to come down personally. Why, that letter was a very strong condemnation of the failure of the United Mine Workers to come to the assistance of those that they should have been representing. And as a longtime supporter of health and safety in all industries, why, Nader's influence was very, very great. He also had great influence in persuading Jock Jablonski to cut his ties with the leadership of the mine workers and actually announce his candidacy. And so Nader in the background was a very influential person, because he was able to focus on some of the problems of the health problems of miners, which were very, very close to his heart. In addition to that, another of the Nader raiders, a young man named Gary Sellers, who had worked for the Bureau of the Budget and had been their expert in coal mine safety and health, joined my staff and assisted me a great deal in the legislation that we were able to get through the Congress in 1969. We also had, I was not on the Education and Labor Committee, which had the responsibility for drafting this legislation. This was both good and bad because it enabled me to introduce far stricter legislation than the committee would even sanction. And at the same time, Sellers was able to persuade a congressman from California named Philip Burton from the Chinatown area of San Francisco, where there were no coal mines, but Sellers talked to him and it was able to persuade him inside of the committee to carry out some of the more aggressive ideas that we had for strengthening the legislation. And the combination of all those things, but the influence of Nader, who had helped to school these Nader's raiders, was extremely effective in this whole battle.